A very good evening everyone. Welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu news analysis. So today is 31st May 2025 and today we have some very important topics for the discussion. So one by one we'll try to discuss all these important topics in a very detailed and in a very crisp manner. So the first topic that we are going to start this discussion is about the Indian education system and how Indian education system is largely failed to equip students with the necessary skills. Because India's growth is rightly called as jobless growth. So I hope all of you knew about this. Because India's growth is called as the jobless growth. Now why India's growth is called as jobless growth? Because we are not able to create adequate number of gainful employment opportunities. But the one reason for the jobless growth in India is because of the lack of skills. We are lacking the necessary skills in the sense that whatever educational institutions that we have, these educational institutions should be linked with the industries. So when we link the academics or educational institutions with the industries, the industry relevant skills can be developed among the students, and that will play a very important role in getting the students readily employable. And that's how we can actually create gainful employment opportunities. However, as of now, we can say that the education system is largely failed to create adequate and gainful employment opportunities for our students. Now in this context, we will understand what are the reasons or what are the factors which are majorly responsible why the education system is not able to equip the students with necessary skills, and these skills are very important. So apart from that, we will also look for the way forward, or we will also look for the suggestions. So how can we make the educational institutions impart the necessary skills among the students so that they can be readily get employment opportunities in the industries, and how can we link the educational institutions with the industries as well? So we are going to look at these things in a detailed manner. So let's try to understand the context. So as I have already given you a brief introduction of this topic, and in fact this article has been given in the Hindu newspaper, right? So this is the editorial that has been given in the Hindu newspaper, and this is very important for your General Studies paper 3, particularly the economic section. And within General Studies paper 3, there is a topic called unemployment. There's a topic called unemployment, and in this particular topic, so there might be a mains question that can be asked. So let's have a look at this particular topic and what the author is trying to say here. So the context is that, we all knew that in the higher educational institutions there is a growing enrollment. So enrollment has been increasing in the higher educational institutions. So therefore it has been highlighting that there existing a vibrant academic landscape, right? So there is a vibrant and also a dynamic academic landscape has been existing, and this is evident from the fact that there is a rising enrollment across the Indian colleges. So even though there is a vibrant academic landscape, there is a sharp increase in the unemployment among the graduates. For example, millions of passed out graduates, so they are not able to get the proper or adequate employment opportunities, and that is where the main problem lies in. However, it is being said that a widening gap between the academic qualification. For example, imagine a candidate. So this particular candidate have a higher qualification, he might have masters, he might even do the PhD, but there is a gap, that is the academic qualifications and employment. So despite having PhD, he is not able to get the employment. right? So you can see here there is a growing gap between academic qualifications and employability, especially in non-elite institutions. So therefore this particular thing calls for an urgent reform to align the education system with the market needs. For example, what exactly industry or the market requires, and we need to align the teaching standards or the curriculum in these educational institutions along with the market requirements, right? Only then we will be able to ensure that the students are readily getting employment. And in fact, remember that India is a country with a huge demographic dividend. I hope you knew what exactly is a demographic dividend. So it actually means that the large number of population who are in the working age group, a large number of population who are in the working age group, and they are being called as, and that is being called as the demographic dividend. And in fact, India is going to benefit from this demographic dividend because India's large number of population are in the age group of 14 to 64 years, and this is called as the demographic dividend. And in fact, this demographic advantage will exist another 30 years for India. So this is called as the demographic window. So we are going to get benefited from this demographic window for another 30 years. So therefore, in this context, whatever demographic dividend that we have, we need to utilize this demographic dividend in an appropriate manner to become a developed country by the year 2047. So remember that we have an aspiration to become Vikasit Bharat. We have an aspiration to become Vikasit Bharat by the year 2047. So if we wanted to become a Vikasit Bharat, we should make sure that we need to focus, we need to invest in higher educational institutions, and apart from focusing on higher educational institutions, we should also make sure that the curriculum, this teaching standards should be aligned with the market requirements so that the graduate students would readily get employment in the market. And that is the major aim, that should be the major aim of the higher educational institutions, because in the beginning, as I have already told you, India's growth is called as jobless growth. Why it is a jobless growth? Because the economic growth is not able to create adequate number of employment opportunities, and that's why India's growth is called as jobless growth. So there is no doubt that now India is the fastest growing major economy in the world, and India is also growing at a faster pace. But despite such a huge growth, India is not able to create adequate employment opportunities because majority of the growth in India is just concentrated in the service sector alone. Since majority of the growth in India is concentrated in the service sector alone, and service sector on the other hand is a capital intensive sector, and this is also the less labor intensive and more capital intensive, and that's why service sector is not able to create adequate employment opportunities in India. Now coming back to this particular topic, now recently Ministry of Statistics has published a data. So this data with respect to the unemployment that is existing in India. So what does this data shows actually? So this data indicates that there is an increase in the higher education, right? So there is higher education employment, higher education enrollment has been increasing, right? So enrollment in higher education has been increasing. So even though enrollment has been increasing, there is a decline in the employment rate, right? So there is a decline in the employment rate, or I can also say that there is an increase in the unemployment rate. So I can say that there is a widening gap. So there is a widening gap. So how there is a widening gap? Because on the other hand, there is an increase in the enrollment of students in the higher education, and at the same time there is also an increase in the unemployment in India. So I can call this as the widening gap. because the graduates are not able to get adequate job opportunities, adequate employment opportunities. So it has been further widening. Particularly when we talk about the educational institutions, there are tier 2 and tier 3 colleges. So both tier 2 and tier 3 colleges have been struggling with resource constraints. So these colleges have resource constraints, one, right? So apart from having resource constraints, they also have the outdated curricula. So curriculum which don't suits to the present needs, curriculum which is not aligned to the market requirements. However, this is mostly a problem in tier 2 plus tier 3 cities. Tier 2, tier 3 cities, this is the most pressing challenge that the educational institutions have been facing. So I am repeating it again. So the resource constraints and outdated curricula, right? So outdated curricula that these colleges have been facing. So therefore, because of these constraints, what has been happening, it ultimately limits students' readiness despite rising enrollment in the undergraduate and postgraduate courses. So ultimately it has been resulting in a lack of adequate job opportunities or employment opportunities for the graduate youth in India. And similarly, there are number of courses, right? So in these higher educational institutions, the problem is that there are number of courses, but most of these courses have been emphasizing on either abstract knowledge with little focus on the practical skills. However, in order to get readily employed, a particular individual need to equip with the practical skills, but the students are lacking in these practical skills. Now when I say practical skills, what practical skills are necessary for a particular individual to get employment? For example, professional communication is important, data handling is important, and so all these factors have been leading to an ill prepared for a real world job demand. So these students are not adequately prepared for the job demand that we can actually see outside. So however, on this image you can clearly see that the government of India has launched the Skill India mission, right? So Skill India mission, and the objective of the Skill India mission is to adequately skill the existing workforce so that we can use the demographic dividend in a much more efficient and effective manner. And in fact, the theme of the Skill India mission is skilling youth and building new India. And as part of the Skill India missions, several schemes have been launched. For example, Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Kendras, and they are integration with the general education, and Jan Shikshan Sanstans, Pradhan Mantri Yuva Yojana, and vocational training program for women, Sankalp and Strive programs. So all these programs are part of the Skill India mission so that we will skill our existing workforce. We will focus on the vocational education, vocational training of our students in these educational institutions. Now we'll understand what are the root causes and systematic issues which are existing in the academic culture, because we should also understand what are the root causes, what are the fundamental problems which have been resulting in the low employment opportunities for the students. Now firstly, the higher educational institutions all across India, so they often values the intellectual fulfillment and theoretical knowledge. So we have just talked about the practical skills which suits to the market demand, right? Practical skills which can actually suit the market demand, and that is important and that is also a necessary. But here the problem is that most of the higher educational institutions have been emphasizing on what? So they have been emphasizing on just intellectual fulfillment or the theoretical knowledge. However, in a real world, both intellectual fulfillment and theoretical knowledge is not benefiting the students to get the employment opportunities. right? So in fact they are prioritizing these two things over the employability, with postgraduate degrees sometimes used as a refuge from the job market. Secondly, now we have just talked about the Skill India mission, right? So Skill India mission. So under the Skill India mission, a number of schemes have been launched by the government, and in fact schemes like Skill India, Startup India, and the National Education Policy of 2020, so they specifically focus on skill development, right? So they focus on skill development as well as the entrepreneurship as well, right? So skill development and entrepreneurship as well. But here the problem is that even though they are focusing on skill development and entrepreneurship, they face the implementation challenges. So implementation challenges, particularly with respect to integrating the curriculum, integrating the skills with the curriculum, right? So integrating the skills with curriculum, they have been facing a lot of challenges and a lot of problems, and that's where it is essentially a key issue here. And apart from that, vocational education and vocational training is also very important for the students to get readily employable. However, the problem is that vocational training remains undervalued in most of the educational institutions, and vocational education just preferred or prioritized as a fallback option. But if you look at other countries like China, Japan, and in fact in these countries it is considered as central to workforce development. Of course, in India also it should be considered as a central concept when it comes to the workforce development, right? So vocational training, vocational education would play a very important role, particularly in the development of the industrial-led employment and even the entrepreneurship as well. So therefore the vocational training should be given the central role in the workforce development, thereby limiting its impact on the economic empowerment, right? Because we are not giving adequate importance to the vocational training, right? So if we don't give adequate importance to the vocational training, it will certainly limit the impact of the economic empowerment. So I hope you have understood this. Now if we talk about the way forward, now why we are discussing this particular article, what is the importance that we have been discussing this article, is because the unemployment that has been existing in India, right? So the higher educational institutions or educational institutions are largely failed to impart skills which are relevant, which are needed for the present day market. So in this context, what is required? So reforms have been required. Reforms are required in these educational institutions. So what sort of reforms are required in these higher educational institutions? Now we have just discussed that the higher educational institutions have been facing a problem when it comes to integrating the skills with curricula. They are not able to integrate the necessary and relevant skills with curricula. So therefore, in this context, the core curricula of these educational institutions must consisting of the communication. So communication as an element, it should be the core concept of the curriculum. And apart from that, a digital literacy, data analysis, and other practical modules. So that what happens, it will enhance the overall employability of the students along with developing the theoretical knowledge as well. Because remember that the theoretical knowledge is very important. That has to be theoretical knowledge is important, but along with the theoretical knowledge, so we need to focus on the skill training as well, right? So therefore we need to focus on digital literacy, data analysis, and practical modules and communication, and these should be part of the core curricula of the educational institutions. So if we really wanted to increase the gainful employment opportunities for every student, every graduate. Next, PhD programs, right? So a lot of students, despite having PhD degrees, they remain unemployed. So therefore, the PhD programs should prepare candidates for several roles such as the policy making, analytics, consulting, and industry. So PhD done candidates should not just be limited to the academia, because if anybody do PhD, you might have seen them in teaching positions. So they should not just be limited to the academia alone, but they should play a diverse role, so thereby fostering a wider career opportunities for them as well. So this is also another important area where reforms are required. And similarly, reducing over dependence on the government jobs. And as of now, every graduate, after they become they just pass the graduation, so they are aspiring for the government jobs, right? So because of their aspirations for the government jobs, what has been happening, they are not able to take up the existing opportunities in the private sector, right? So they are not focusing on the development of skills as well. So it is very, very important that in India, the young people particularly dependent on the government jobs, and there is a need to reduce the over dependence on the government jobs, and that requires strengthening the existing private sector. And apart from that, there is a need to promote entrepreneurship. For example, the Startup India program, Stand Up India program, Make in India program. So all these programs have been launched by the government to improve or to encourage entrepreneurship, right? So there should be an enhanced focus on skill building as well as the employability initiatives. So they have to be focused in an adequate manner. So these are some reforms that can be brought in, right? So these are some reforms that can actually be brought in the higher educational institutions, so that students can get readily employed. And we can also reduce or bridge the gap between increasing enrollment in the higher educational institutions and also the growing unemployment rates as well. Now you can also see that Skill India program focuses on employability of the students, and it focuses on economic growth aspect, technological integration, competitiveness of the Indian economy when we compare it with the economies of other countries, and the competitiveness of the economies of different states within India. And it also focuses on developing the entrepreneurial spirit along with the social inclusion as well. I hope you have understood this particular article, and this is very, very important for your General Studies paper 3. And next important topic is the declining school enrollment in some states, particularly declining enrollment in the government schools. And this is a concern because most of the students, most of the parents are preferring the private schools instead of the government schools, and this is concerning. And this is also pointing out towards the fact that the government educational institutions have poor teaching standards, they lack necessary and adequate infrastructure, and that is why despite a higher fee, the parents have been preferring the private educational institutions. So this is a concern, and we will also discuss what needs to be done so that parents would join their children in the government educational institutions, and that will also make access to education to everybody, and we should also focus on the quality education as well. So we'll try to understand the context of this article. The context is that Ministry of Education recently raised some concerns, right? So what was the concern of the Ministry of Education? The concern is that the rising private school enrollment alongside a declining government school participation. For example, there is an increase in the private school enrollment, right? So a increase in the private school enrollments, but there is a decline in the government school enrollment. So therefore the Ministry of Education has raised concern, but this trend is particularly more visible in states like Andhra Pradesh, Telangana and Uttarakhand, right? So this particular trend is clearly visible in states like Andhra Pradesh, Telangana and Uttarakhand. So despite having a more number of government schools, because the government has established a many number of government schools, particularly after the Right to Education Act. So I hope you knew that we have a Right to Free and Compulsory Education Act. So after the Right to Education Act, there were more number of government schools which are established. But despite such government schools, the problem is lack of quality teaching, or poor teaching standards is a problem, and lack of quality infrastructure in schools. For example, drinking water, toilets and security for the girls students, right? So these are all the problems that the educational institutions, particularly the government educational institutions, are very often facing. So therefore, despite several government schools, student preference is shifting towards the private unaided institutions. So what are these unaided institutions? These are the institutions which don't receive any aid, any assistance from the government. Now parents have been preferring the unaided private institutions instead of the government schools. Now here, when parents prefer the unaided private schools for the education of the children, so here it actually creates challenges for public education schemes like Samagra Shiksha and PM Poshan Abhiyan scheme. Now PM Poshan specifically talks about the nutritious food, a nutritious meal for the school going kids under midday meal program, and Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan. So this is a comprehensive educational coverage program for the students. Now here you can see the trend that there has been an increasing the private school enrollment, right? Particularly in few states, there has been a rising enrollment of students in the private educational institutions, and there is a decline in the enrollment of students in the government educational institutions. However, the increasing the private school enrollment is particularly visible in states like Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana and Uttarakhand. And in fact, the private schools also account for the higher percentage of the total enrollment. For example, if I can take an imaginary number, imagine that there are 1,000 students, and out of 1,000 students, around 600 to 700 students have been preferring the private educational institutions instead of the government educational institutions. So despite there are more number of the government educational institutions in India. And apart from that, the government schools constitute a majority of the schools, but they face a decline in the overall student number, and this is particularly a concern. So I hope you have understood this. So there are some examples also given. For example, Andhra Pradesh government schools form 73% of the total schools in the state of Andhra Pradesh, but only 46% of the total number of students study in these government schools. And similarly, at Telangana, around 70% of the total schools are the public schools or the government schools, but only 38.11% of the enrollment is in the government schools. So you can see the numbers. So how parents have been clearly favoring clearly favoring the private educational institutions. And in fact, Uttarakhand, 72% of the schools are the government schools, but only 36.68% of the enrollment is in the private government schools, right? So therefore, there is a clear trend of declining enrollments in the government educational institutions, and this is particularly a concern. And in fact, a detailed difference between the private educational institutions and the government educational institutions have been given here, and because of that reason, parents have been preferring the private educational institutions over the government educational institutions. Now here we have given a comprehensive analysis. Now comprehensive analysis which primarily indicates why parents prefer the private educational institution. So what are the problems in the government education institutions? And in fact, so the shift of enrollment from the government schools to private schools, so it actually highlights some systematic challenges, right? So what sort of a systematic challenges are existing in the government schools, and because of that reason, parents clearly preferring the private educational institutions. So imagine that I have already mentioned about those challenges. For example, inadequate infrastructure, whether it is drinking water, toilets, or the walls, playgrounds. So there is inadequate infrastructure. And quality of teaching is also very poor. Teachers are not well qualified. There is a lack of skills among the teachers. Teachers are not able to teach English or any other subjects, right? And also the perception issues in the society, right? For example, if any child is going to a government school, then the perception would be like a negative perception being attached to that, which is existing in the society. For example, only poor goes to the government schools, not rich people. So rich people or well-off people, they go to or they prefer the private school. So it becomes a status symbol as well. So therefore, there are some perception issues as well which are coming into play. And similarly, despite having a greater accessibility to the government schools in terms of numbers, in terms of enrollment, so it actually reflects the parental preference driven by aspirations for better educational outcomes, right? So, and in fact, because of all these drawbacks which are existing in the government educational institutions, parents aspiring for the higher educational outcomes among their children, they are preferring the private educational institutions, because private educational institutions are comparatively better when it comes to the physical infrastructure, quality of teaching, and social perception also aligns with this, and that's why parents have been readily preferring the private educational institutions. However, so this phenomenon actually risks increasing educational inequality. Why it risks increasing educational inequality? Because when a less number of students are studying in the government educational institutions, there is a probability that the teaching standards may compromise, right? So, and there will be a less attention, less focus towards the students who joined in the government educational institutions. So therefore, it has been indicating that this can actually risk increasing educational inequality, because the economically disadvantaged children may be left behind if government schools further gets weakened. And in fact, government expenditure on several schemes such as Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan and PM Poshan scheme, so is a substantial, right? So government has been substantially spending on these programs, but declining enrollment actually undermines the effective utilization of these funds that the government has been spending. And in fact, during COVID-19 pandemic, what has happened? So during COVID-19 pandemic, most of the schools, including the private schools also, so they shut down. But here the difference is that the private schools were able to organize the classes for the students through the digital methods. However, it is absent in the government schools. Through the digital mode, the private schools were able to organize classes for the students. Right, so this is also another major reason that has particularly accelerated the enrollment into the private educational institutions instead of the government educational institutions, right? So in this context, it is very, very important that the government needs to make a substantial investment in the public educational institutions, whether it is with respect to infrastructure, drinking water, sanitation, nutrition, midday meal scheme, teaching standards, skilling of the teachers, improving the learning outcomes, curricula. So therefore, the parents would believe in these government schools, and there will be increased enrollment in the government schools, and this will also ensure the educational equity as well, not just educational equality but even the educational equity as well, and that is very, very important for any school, right? So therefore, in this context, when I say the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan, so Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan would have a lot of benefits, right? So Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan, so this Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan would have a lot of benefits because it actually covers the primary education in a much more comprehensive manner. And apart from that, apart from the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan, so we also talked about the PM Poshan Abhiyan as well. So through PM Poshan Abhiyan, a comprehensive nutrition coverage is being provided to the children, right? So these are the advantages of adequately these are the advantages of students being part of the government educational institutions, right? So that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much.